All right, this is the third part of my lectures on the Civil War. Just a quick review of how our government works here. So, if you have a majority in Congress, that'll give you a legislative power. Right, it's a Congress that makes laws. Right? And the key law here we're talking about is tariff legislation, and this is going to lead to the Southern economic demise. Right. So, first of all, the two key economic threats to the South were one, tariffs, which would kill the cotton export based economy, and two, the North's Western expansion economic agenda, which would create wealth and opportunity in the North, and that would increase migration into the North, which would increase their population, which would increase their voting rolls, right? Their demographics, and increase Northern political power at the expense of the South, right? So this wasn't about Southern economy, right? But it is about Southern political power or lack thereof relative to the North. According to the Constitution, regular bills require a simple majority, right? You're going back to seventh grade to learn in both chambers, and then signing by the president. If the president vetoes a bill, then it requires a two-thirds majority in both houses to override the veto. All right. With the 1860 election, the Northern Republicans gained the majority control in both the House and the Senate, and they also had the president, Lincoln. The moral tariff had already passed the Republican-controlled House in May of 1860, right? Thus, after the 1860 election, there was no stopping the moral tariff from passing. This spelled economic doom for the South, and the moral tariff, in fact, did pass on March 2nd, 1861, and was signed by President Buchanan, the outgoing president, right? 2 days before Lincoln was inaugurated. Okay, so now let's get to the key battle lines here. The key battle line was tariffs, and I'll show the historical development of this. I start here saying I desperately want to explain how tariffs would kill the Southern cotton export economy, but I'll hold off on the economic explanation until the very end because I fear that may be too abstract for most readers and thus not seem real and credible to them. Right? So instead, I'll show the history of the tariff battle to prove one, that this was the key battle line between North and South, two, that high tariffs were bad for the South, right? So I'm going to try to explain this without an economic explanation by simply pointing the fact that the South always desperately battled for low tariffs, which would logically indicate that high tariffs were bad for the South. Right? We went through the explanation already. Right? Our nation's first tariff. So our first tariff was in the Constitution. It was standard across the board, 15% tariff. And that was ratified in 1788. Right? So our next tariff was 1816, which raised the rates from 15% to 25. This tariff passed with Southern support due to there was a federal budget deficit, and the only source of tax revenues at that time and for a long time was import tariffs. The British were aggressively dumping manufactured goods, probably with differential pricing, right, into the United States at the time, which at the time impacted Southern industries before their hard shift to cash crop export. Right, recall that early on the northern and southern economies were fairly similar. Maybe they had different agricultural goods, whatever, right? But as far as the proportion of industries to agricultural, both had low amounts of industries, but they both had some, right? That would shift in the South. All right. Patriotism in the wake of the War of 1812. So we had just finished fighting the British between 1812 and 1815, right? So there was a lot of patriotism against Great Britain, and this kind of helped, motivate the South to vote for this because this was against Great Britain, right? Never mind the fact that we started this war, but even though we started a war, people are going to point the finger, and certainly Great Britain was a troublemaker. They're trying to screw with us. Continued border conflict with Great Britain, not just in the north, but in the south as well. That's part of how they're screwing with us, right? Yeah, so in the South, I mean, it wasn't just Canada, it wasn't just the Great Lakes area, it was in the South. Remember Pensacola, Florida? We had to kick them out in 1814, right? And I say here Louisiana, I can't remember what actually went on. But I had this in my notes, so there must have been something here. I just can't remember what it is. All right. Southern support for the 1816 tariff ended with the 1819 panic, which saw a plummet in cotton exports, and cotton prices plummeted as well. So, with this, clearly the South now understood how import tariffs harm their cotton exports, right? All right. Okay, so then in 1824, the Northern and Western political slash economic alliance gained a majority in Congress, and they passed a 50% tariff. So that's pretty high. And this kicked off the fierce tariff battles. Yeah, because this is pretty darn hard. 4 years later, in 1828, the Northern Western Political Economic Alliance still controlled Congress, and it passed an even higher tariff, roughly around 65%, which is the highest tariff in our history, which the South hated so much they dubbed it the Tariff of Abominations. Right? So they're calling it the Tariff of Abominations. You think the South, right, uh, benefited from high tariffs? I mean, come on. I'm not going to explain the economics yet, but just look at the simple logic here. They're calling it the tariff of abominations. You think it's helping them? All right. All right. Just in simple terms. In 1832, a reduced tariff was passed to mollify the Southern outcry. All right, reduced to roughly 32%, and my chart says about 40%. It also included a promise to further lower tariffs to 20% after 10 years. Right? Now, South Carolina was not appeased by this, and they threatened secession. They said, "We're not going to pay this damn tariff." Right? And then they took actions to defend, to preparative actions to defend Charleston Harbor from federal closure, which is the very same threat that started the Civil War. Right? Remember, the Civil War was started by the Confederate attack upon Fort Sumter, which is in the mouth of Charleston Harbor. I'll show you that in a second. Thus, a civil war almost began in 1832, 30 years before. And what was it over? It was over tariffs, right? So explain Charleston Harbor with pictures. Okay, so let's go to that now here. All right, so first of all, the refusal of a state or any region to pay federal tax is sedition and de facto secession. Right? Now, you cannot let any region not pay federal taxes because then all the other regions are going to say, why should we pay? If they don't have to pay, why should we pay? And then what happens, right? There's no revenue for the government to operate. So your government collapses, which means your country collapses, right? Which means your nation collapses. You can't allow that, right? They got to pay their damn taxes. For a state to survive, secession must be resisted with force. All right, all right. You can't let them. Right. You got to stop this because South Carolina had a cotton export-based economy. To defeat South Carolina, federal forces need only blockade their port of export, Charleston, to destroy their economy. Right. So South Carolina saying, "Hey, we're not paying it. We're going to go independent here." Right. And the federal government says, "Oh, no, you're not." All right. Now, what does the federal government have to do? Do they have to invade every plantation, every farm, every bit of territory, every open field within South Carolina? No. This is predominantly an export-based economy, mostly on cotton, but also other things like tobacco. All right. So if that's the case, you shut down the choke point right here, their port of export right there, Charleston. Shut that down, and in one fell swoop, you whack their economy. Now you know what's going to happen. What's going to happen? They're going to try to get smuggling out of different little areas here, right? It's going to be small scale. It's going to be small boats. They're trying to get some fast, small fast sloops. It's going to carry low cargo. It's going to be inefficient, whatever. And you can combat that too, right? All right. Okay. So let's see here. Where are we at here? Okay. The South Carolinas recognized this vulnerability of the port and thus took action to defend the port of Charleston. This is the exact same action they took in April 12th, 1861, in attacking Fort Sumter. So this is the exact same thing. In fact, Lincoln said in his inaugural address, right? He pointed to this. He said, uh, you know, he said all this stuff that, hey man, no one's trying to free the slaves, right? What are you talking about? In fact, Congress just passed 2 days ago an amendment to the Constitution guaranteeing your right to keep slaves forever. What are you talking about? We're trying to free this. We're guaranteeing you this, right? With an amendment to the Constitution. And then he said stuff like, "Well, you don't go take, uh, free black men from the North and kidnap them, make them slaves in the South, right?" And he said, Fugitive Slave Act. Hey, we'll honor that law, right? In fact, we're going to beef up that law. Every black slave that runs away, we'll send back, right? Right? And then he said, but you got to pay your taxes, right? You got to honor federal tax, and uh, you 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 cannot seize federal property. Now, what does that mean? National parks? No, that means forts. That means armories, all right? So, and that was what Charleston happened, right? So, so the idea is this, okay? All you got to do is shut down this harbor right here, Charleston Harbor, right? And there's Fort Sumter right in the mouth, right? And I read a little bit about this. There are other forts up here somewhere, right? I think two or three other forts, and the overall area commander for the federal forces, you're right, thought these forts were indefensible. So he said we got to consolidate. We'll go to this island here, and Fort Sumter, and so they brought all the forces here, and then the Confederates bombed the hell out of this with like big mortar things. All right. So, right, attacking Fort Sumter, which the federal government could use to block export and thus destroy the South Carolina economy. Right. This means the Civil War nearly started 32 years or 30 years prior, right, and it was over tariffs. All right. So now, next tariff was in 1842, right? Remember I said in 1832 there was a promise to reduce tariffs to 20%. That promise finally goes into effect, but the Republic, the Northern Whigs still held Congress, right, and they passed a 40% tariff, you know. So immediately when it went down to 20, well, they doubled it again right away, and I'm sure that pissed off a lot of Southerners. I mean, I'm sure it made them crazy mad, you know. You promised this, we've been waiting 10 years, and now you jack it up right away. I bet that really, yanked their cord. Um, by 1845, the Southern Democrats finally gained control of Congress, and they passed a reduced tariff to 25%. Then in 1857, they're still controlling Congress, the Southern Democrats, and they reduced the tariff to 17%. Right? Then in May of 1860, Republicans controlled the House, but not the Senate. Democrats controlled the Senate, and the House passed a moral tariff to increase the tariff. And however, the bill was stalled in committee in the Senate by Senator Hunter, who was the chairman of the Finance Committee. Right. So the rule was that the chairman of the committee determines when a bill is ready to go before the full floor, and he's like, "Oh, it's not ready. Not ready." He's stalled. Right. However, with the 1860 election and the clean sweep by the Republican Party taking control of the House, Senate, and President, there was no stopping the moral tariff. So here's a quick chronology of what the events that happened. Right. We'll start with more stuff happened in this, but we'll just keep our focus limited here. Right. 1860 election, the Republicans won a clean sweep, House, Senate, President. And then about a month later, South Carolina secedes, first with cries of the North is going to free the slaves. Right? So the South Carolina economy was heavily, dependent upon cotton exports. Right? Then, just 9 days later, the House of Representatives offers guaranteed perpetual protection of slavery with an amendment to the Constitution. They offered New Mexico as a slave state to expand slavery. They offered beefing up the Fugitive Slave Act to eliminate local opposition and make indictment of runaway slaves. Yeah. So what they're saying is this is sole jurisdiction of the federal government, right? Local governments don't have squat say in this, right? And then it said we're gonna make indictment of runaway slaves prima facie, which means, as far as I understand, you're guilty until proven innocent. You're just squat guilty, right? Uh, all right, okay. So um, Mississippi secede. Okay, so now all these secede, right? Then you get the moral tariff, right? Buchanan signed the same day, and then you have the Corwin Amendment the same day. Then you have Lincoln inauguration, right? His speech, right? And then you have Confederates bombard Fort Sumter. So the Corwin Amendment passed here, right? Right. Soon on the heels of that, they start the war. Right? War started, and then the rest of the southern states secede: Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. All right. So the key battle line was tariffs, which determined economic fortunes. Boom for the North, bust for the South. Democrats controlled Congress, so whenever the Democrats controlled Congress, they lowered tariffs. Whenever Republicans controlled Congress, they raised tariffs. Right? This is clear battle lines. When Republicans won a clean sweep in 1860, Southern states started seceding, claiming the North was trying to free the slaves. But was that real, or was that a cover story? Well, it was absolutely a cover story. All right. I mean, if you remember the evidence I showed you, right, which is always a tricky thing. All right. So again, the first tariff was the Constitution. That was 1788, back here somewhere. It was 15%. Then you have 1816, a patriotic tariff, right, and due to other reasons, right. But that raised it to 25%, supported by the South initially. But by 1819, they were like, man, this tariff stuff is not good for us. It's killing, it's plummeting cotton exports. It's plummeting cotton price. Then in 1824, the Northern and Western Alliance, because they were symbiotically related, they benefited each other, right? They passed a high tariff, about 50%, right? Then in 28, they still controlled Congress, and they passed an even higher tariff, which was so high, it was the highest in our nation here. Look at how high it is, even higher than Smoot-Hawley, right? Which had a bad effect leading to World War II. But anyways, they hated this so much they called it a tariff of abominations. You know, it's almost like a biblical term. All right. Okay. 1832. Yeah, they reduced a lower tariff, but it wasn't enough. See, mine says about 42% here, roughly, right? My notes said 32%. Maybe it was 42. I don't know. I should look that up again. But anyways, okay, so it wasn't enough to mollify South Carolina, and they're saying, "Screw it, we're not paying this tariff," right? So the Civil War almost occurred here, and then 10 years later, you finally get it's supposed to go down to 20%, right? But the Republicans jack it up right away in 1842, back about 35%, right? And then the Democrats come into power, they reduce it to 25%. And then they're still in power. They reduced it to 17. So this is not quite right here. It shows about 20% here. But you see it's coming down. When the Democrats are in power, they're lowering it. But then Republicans come in power. And for the next roughly 25 years, Republicans dominate Congress. And they maintain high tariffs. All right. So here's a quick review. Political control means control of legislation, and the key legislation in this case was tariffs. All right, and that determines the economic fortunes, either boom or bust. Good for the North, bad for the South. This means the battle over economic fortunes began with political power. All right, so it started all back here. Who had political power? But ultimately, the bottom line was economics. Right, how it's affecting your wallet. So now we'll examine the North-South battle over political power, right? I'll do that in the next lesson here. Let me take a break here.